Professor Tirole, it's an honor to have opportunity to talk with you today. My name is Bahadur. I am here as a part of Gazeta.uz. If you are ready, we will start. Let's clarify some concepts before starting the conversation. What is monopoly for you?
Monopoly is a firm that can actually impact the outcomes in the market very strongly. So it can raise the price, or it can produce a low quality and still get the consumer, keep the consumer, because there is no alternative. And that's a monopoly, and that's bad for society. It's bad for society for two reasons. The first is that the prices are high or the quality is low. The second thing is that monopolies don't innovate very much, because they have an easy life. So they don't need to innovate because they will keep the customers anyway. So that's why we need to have a policy which goes against monopolies.
The anti-monopoly authority of different countries evaluates monopoly differently. For example, it's common to assess enterprises as monopolies based on their market share. And do you think this measurement is correct?
It's a first measurement. In the end, as economists, we know that market share is not enough to know whether, because you could have firms which have a large market share, they're a bit better than the others, but they are threatened by competition, which keeps them on their toes. Conversely, we also know of firms which have a low market share, but a lot of power. So for example, I was discussing platforms economics. So Booking, for example, may have a 20% market share in the market for travel, but at the same time be a monopolist on its own customer, because the users, the business users like hotels, have only Booking to reach the Booking customers. So this is a more complicated thing. So market share is useful as a first guess, but only a good analysis they will need to be performed in order to know whether there is actually a lot of market power.
What is the difference between Carlos Slim and Bill Gates, you think?
Between what?
Carlos Slim and Bill Gates.
Well, there is this debate. I mean, Bill Gates has of course, like all those tech entrepreneurs, they have innovated a lot. There are other billionaires who actually have their wealth come from basically friendship with the government or some chance. They got to prioritize some raw materials or the like. And of course, the former are more deserving because they create value for society. They don't only extract value. But of course, even Bill Gates, who actually has created a lot of value for mankind, can also be we see that Google can also be a monopolist, and Apple and all the tech companies can be also monopolists, and they can also do damage to the economy. So they deserve, they're producing a great service, so they deserve to rewards from that, but at the same time they should be playing by the rules and basically not abuse their monopoly position.
How do monopolies arise in society, you think?
How do they arise in society? Well, it's linked with the previous question. Some of the monopolies may be deserved because they innovate, they create something totally new. Some of the monopolies are not deserved because they come from chance or from basically being friendly with politicians. They get a monopolist from that, or so we have to distinguish between the monopolies. And that's why actually in the US, for example, monopolies per se are not illegal. Monopolies are legal. What is legal is the abuse of dominant position. That's a bit different.
What's the role of industrial policy carried out by the state in this?
So there are different roles for industrial policy. They can enable innovations by doing, for example, fundamental research or supporting in fundamental research, and also education, of course. That's a humble role, but you still need a good governance in order for the money to be used efficiently. There are more different examples of industrial policy where the government decides what's to be done, who is going to be the winner, and that's much more controversial because the government may not have the information to decide what is going to succeed and what's going to not succeed. And think about a sector like agriculture, for example. In agriculture, you don't know what crop will be successful or will be useful. So, for example, if there is not enough water, it's important, for example, to price water so that people don't waste it. It's very important to have a price high enough for water so that people internalize the scarcity of water. But then, things are going to change because the location of crops and the crops themselves are going to change. So, for example, in regions where there is a big shortage of water, the farmers are going to use low water intensity crops, which do not use much water, and that will be much more efficient. In regions where there is a lot of water, that doesn't matter, so they can develop other crops. So the market mechanism is going to be very important, but you need the market to have the right signal, and they must have the signal with respect to water when it's scarce, with respect to carbon emission, and so on. So it's very important for the market to decide, but with the right signals, and the right signals have to be provided by the government on the scarcity of water or on the cost of carbon through carbon pricing.
Is there a relationship between the size of the role of the state in the economy and the possibility of monopolies?
Oh, I'm not sure. I mean, the question is, why is the state large? Yes. And it can be large because it's full of state-owned enterprises, which in general are monopolies. They are often monopolies because they ask for protection. Or the state is large because it's investing in the education of children, which is, of course, much more desirable. Or the state is large because of the welfare state, so the size of the state has many different reasons, factors, and in general you cannot just say there's a mapping from the size of the state with the monopoly and the degree of monopolization in the industries.
What if this size from industrial policy?
Industrial policy, as I mentioned, there are good aspects and bad aspects. The good aspect is when it starts fostering innovation, not necessarily doing the innovation itself, but creating the environment through fundamental research and development of skills for students, and many other policies. And that's very good industrial policy. It's going to be very useful for the country if it's done right. But industrial policy which decides who is going to be the winner is less attractive because of informational primes. Even a benevolent government may face difficulties in knowing, should you invest, for example, if you want to reduce carbon emissions, should you invest in hydrogen or other carbon capture or whatever. We don't quite know what's going to work, and we have to be humble. So basically, it's better actually to give incentive for carbon reduction through carbon pricing, carbon price, and also through innovation, give incentive for innovation, green innovation. But it's hard to decide because we may get it wrong, and nobody knows actually. So.
Uh-huh. And could you explain, is monopoly bad or good thing in the first place, and it from the perspective of an ordinary citizen, why it's bad or why it's good? And in your opinion, are there sectors of economy where the state should have monopoly?
Oh, that's a good thing. I mean, obviously, whenever there's damage for the consumers, like for example, gaming, where people are addicted to games, for example. It's better if the state at least controls. It could be the private sector doing it, but at least controls to reduce the addiction to gaming, but for some people, to alcohol, to drugs, and things like that. But in general, the state is not there to produce, and that's important to understand. It has to create things. Sure, it has to create, an electricity network, a train network, and things like that, and a legal framework in which the private sector can operate with strong legal rights and legal certainty. That's very important for the private sector. But then, the efficiency will be brought by the private sector. And what the state should be doing there is basically keep under control the monopoly power through competition policy and make sure there is competition and innovation. That's where the state is very important. It's a referee, it's not a player. It's not a player in the industrial game, it's a referee. And the referee makes sure that everybody can compete.
Mm-hmm. How can the state lose the monopolies it has created within the framework of industrial policy by itself, or return them to free market?
So you are talking about privatization here.
Yes.
This is a difficult issue because we have seen, in particular in former Soviet republics, that sometimes privatization was very unequal because some big firms were given to oligarchs or something like that. So that's an issue. I mean, you have various possibilities. You could have sales. If you have a competitive buyer market, so basically making sure that there is enough competition. It's not one buyer or two buyers. There's actually competition, sometimes to foreigners possibly. The foreigners can actually be useful to buy if they buy at the right price. Of course, the idea is not to expropriate the country. Those are assets of the country. It's very important that the foreigners, for example, pay the right price. Or it could be domestic players paying the price. That's a possibility. You also can give some shares to the citizens, or basically, but you can also use that as use that money that you get from selling the shares for purposes like research and education and the like. So, it's a difficult issue because you start from an economy which is entirely public. Everything is under state control, and you want to move to a private marketplace. As I insist on very regulated marketplace, but a private one. And then there's a stage at which you have to sell those assets to someone. And the last thing you want to do is to give it to oligarch or to sell them way under price. So you want to create competition for those assets.
Mm-hmm. Where is the line between antitrust and the obstruction of development crossed?
Between antitrust and?
Obstruction of development.
No, I think competition is good for development. And if you think, for example, about China, for example, something that has changed a lot in China after 1980 was a competition. Competition between firms and competition between regions. And that has been very important. And you see what happened to Southeast Asia, for example, and Korea, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan. They were very poor after World War II. They were incredibly poor. And then they turned into extremely well-developed economies, and there are many reasons for that, but competition was one thing to basically get enough competition. Sometimes the competition came from abroad, not necessarily inside, because you may not have enough scale to get many big firms. But sometimes the competition comes from abroad through gradual removal of trade barriers, for example. So that you keep the monopolies on their toes and say, if you don't innovate, if you're not better, if you don't charge lower price, you're going to lose the war.
What should be done so that the fight against monopolies doesn't become a tool of other purposes?
So what do you have in mind there?
I'm thinking about that antitrust policy may become to distract our economic growth in some points, I think. I
mean, you have a choice. I mean, either you open your economy to the entire world, and then the competition will come from outside. Or you remain protectionist, but then you get monopolies domestically. And then you need a very strong competition policy to avoid that. Probably you need both. You need both. Opening trade barriers is very important, I think, but it has to be done gradually, so so that your firms have time to. I mean, now it has been a long time, of course, for Uzbekistan, and I'm not an expert in Uzbekistan. I want to emphasize that, but you want your firms to be able to prepare, so you want to have a commitment to an opening schedule, and of course not delay that too long. You want to have a threat for your companies to actually join the world market, and then you'll be selling something that you cannot decide on. That will depend on your resources. It could be horticulture, it could be agriculture, it could be manufactured goods, it might be services, and you might sell abroad. Depending on how the skills you develop inside, your natural resources, your opportunities, and that's what the market will tell you in a sense where you will be going. But the important thing is this competitive incentive that is going to make your companies actually improve.
Mm-hmm. Antitrust actions against tech giants are occasionally seen in US. For example, there is a debate about whether companies like Google should be broken up. And what do you think about it?
Well, breaking up Google is much harder than breaking up AT&T, for example. AT&T, if you remember, it was a vertically integrated telecom companies, and basically the bottleneck at the time was the local loop. So basically the copper wire, going to your home. That was a big bottleneck because it was very hard to duplicate. Now we can do it with satellite, but at the time that was not the case. And basically they broke up the local loop, which is a local network. They call that baby bells. And then they had competition in long distance and international calls. I mean, they were not all those services that you have now. So that was a very simple industry at the time. But it was difficult. It took years to do, but there was a clear separation between the local loop and the long distance services. In the same way, some railroads were cut in, between the tracks and stations, which are natural monopoly. You're not going to have multiple tracks and station in Tashkent. It's very difficult. So you have a natural monopoly there. But for train services, train operations, you can have competition. Or electricity, that's very big. In electricity, the grid, high voltage grid and low voltage grid, is a natural monopoly that you have to keep as a monopoly and regulate. But the production of renewables, for example, it can be completely competitive. Those are examples of breaking up. But those are relatively simple industries. It's harder with Google because it's changing very fast. The bottleneck is changing very fast. And you see with AI, for example, the search engine, which was a bottleneck, may no longer be a bottleneck, and it will be another bottleneck. And we have seen that. In Microsoft, the bottleneck was the operating system, and now it has been changing. Now Microsoft is very strong in other areas. That moving very fast. So breaking up is actually very hard for the new economy. Some people have proposed that. Why not? But it's very difficult to understand how it will be done. So I'm more in favor of regulation as opposed to breaking up. But who knows? I mean, things might change, and we have to be humble.
What do you think? Why in recent history economists, except writing scientific papers, are started to join in public debates, and why it is important?
Well, I mean, economists have always joined in the public debate. I mean, if you think about Keynes, for example, or Samuelson, people like that were very active in the public debate. But probably you're right. I mean, probably there are more economists joining the public debate nowadays. And my own view is that it's particularly important because it's about the functioning of democracies. I will discuss that this afternoon, but when I talk about the common goods. But prior to the Nobel Prize, I did a lot of policy work, but always with experts. So it could be experts in government, experts in central banks, experts in firms, in industry, experts. But a democracy cannot just function if only the experts have the knowledge. You need the population as a whole to have the knowledge. Now, of course, they are not going to get a PhD in economics, but they must have some basic knowledge of economic conditions and the like, and reasoning. What's going on. So you need to be talking to a broader audience. That's why I wrote the book Economics for the Common Good, but it's also, I think more and more economists are realizing that they also have a social duty of communicating. Our own incentive, because we are researchers, is to do the research. So my life is doing research and talking to the students. That's my life. But I now realize that there's a third thing I should be doing more, which is talking to the wider audience, because a democracy cannot function without the wider population being associated with the scientific and economic debates. And nowadays we see with populism, there's a very, very high danger for the democracies and also for the autocracies. There's a lot of populism where politicians use fake news and bad reasoning, and they pander to the electorate with a lot of things like nationalism and the like. And that's a big danger, and we have to explain things. And that's where I think the intellectuals that has become their duty actually to participate. Even so, I myself, I enjoy being in my laboratory and talking to my students and doing research more than I enjoy talking to a wider audience.
Now I want to ask some question about education as a scientist too. How do you think an effective higher education system is built, and what's the role of the state here?
So the role of the state is very important because it has to finance higher education and research to some extent. You can get also financing, some of the financing through tuitions, but of course only the well-to-do households can pay for the tuition. If you want to have access to a wide audience, you need to give scholarships, and you have to finance universities. And it's actually very important. A place like Uzbekistan, where you have all those young people, it's going to be very important to educate them in a proper way. And then it's a huge asset for Uzbekistan, of course. But they have to be educated and get the skills. I mean, that starts way before university, of course. It starts in school, but then the university system is important. And then the state also has to finance fundamental research, breakthrough research. And it has to use the right governance also to do that, a little bit like what DARPA did in the US. And we are trying to, I would like Europe to do as well. But that's an important role of the. But in the end, the innovation are not going to come from the government. The innovation are going to come from the researcher, and we have to attract those researchers. And one issue which was discussed during the lecture today, there were questions about how do you keep people at home, and we face the same issue in Europe. How do we keep people at home and prevent them from going to the US? It's good if some go to the US, but you don't want everybody to live for the US. You want them to come back. And then you have to create a good environment for those as well, so that they have an incentive to come back. They won't get the same pay as in the US, that's sure. But at least that they get a good environment, they are respected. Meritocracy is respected, so the best people get promoted and hired. There are ways of doing that. The governance of universities is very important, of science is very important. And that governance doesn't cost anything. It just costs a legal framework to make sure that there is meritocracy and the like. So That's something we don't have time to discuss, but if you get already a system in place which is very efficient, then you'll get some of the students who go abroad, you'll get them back, and you'll attract them back, and they will be very important because they will train students, and they will advise government, they will advise firms, and they will create a more international environment within the country.
Mm-hmm. What should be the role of state in the higher education market? And the reason asking this question is all universities in Uzbekistan are owned or licensed by the state, and students receive the same state standard diploma. What is your opinion about such regulation and participation in higher education market? It's explained by the government as protecting consumers from poor quality education and fraud.
My view is that the main issue is not whether it's a state or the private sector. The main issue is the incentives which are provided so that universities must innovate themselves. It's not only the researchers who innovate, but the universities, they must innovate in the process and in the programs, in their governance and so on. So that I think is the most important thing. And you need competition among universities so that the university has an incentive to actually improve their quality. And I'm talking not only about the top universities, but also the lower tier universities, because they also can be extremely important in teaching, for example. They can teach very well, so, and create good environments for the students. So it's an entire ecosystem where first, the universities which innovate and do well for their students, because the customer is a student, right? The customer is not the professor or the researcher, it's in the end very much a student, and to offer a good service to the students so that the students can actually get skills. And the universities which work hard on that, they should be rewarded both by the government but also by the students themselves, who are going to vote with their feet. If they know that a place is doing very well, then they will go to that place. And that's very important. So the information of the students is also important, so that they know that there are quality differences. And of course, you don't want the lower quality universities to stay low quality. You want them also to progress. It's an entire system, because it's very important to have innovation through experimentation in elite universities. And NUU is a good example of that. And it's very, very important, because that shows that things can be done differently. But then it has to pull the entire system to the top, and slowly, and just trying to offer a good education to most of the young people.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the standard diploma system is a problem for signaling in higher education market for the companies?
Well, the companies need the diploma to be sure of what has been learned by the student, and also that also means that the students also pass the entry exams. So that's important, and I don't think we can have only one quality, and that's something that Europeans often try to do, but they fail to do. To say all the universities have the same level, and the answer is that's not true in practice, and the students don't have the same level either. It's not because some are stupid; it's simply that they were not prepared as well. So if you come from a poor family in a rural area, you may not be prepared for university the same way as someone who is in a sophisticated environment, grew up in a sophisticated environment in a city and well-to-do family, right? So students are prepared. Some are very well prepared, some are poorly prepared, and you have to accommodate all of that. But you need to have different level of university so that people who are not very well prepared can follow, and then if they do well, they can actually join one of the elite university, right? So you must have bridges so that you can start in a lower university, and if you do well, then you can move to an elite university. But the fiction that every university is the same, it's not true, right? I mean, that's not true. And this is bad actually for the students who are not well prepared, because they are put in an environment where they cannot follow. Even so they are bright, they are motivated, they still cannot follow because they are not very well prepared.
Mm-hmm. Professor Tirole, thank you for your time.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you.